Many believe that a father should be every young child's hero, a calming presence, a safety blanket, and someone that will understand you no matter what. And because of that perception that we hold, this case both shocked, disgusted, and disturbed families all around the globe. Because in April 2008, a 24-year web of lies and horror would be uncovered. Josef Fritzl kidnapped, abused, and tortured not only his own child, but also her children. But just how did this man get away with his crimes for so long, fooling not only authorities, but family and friends alike? This is a story of captivity, resilience, and eventually an escape. A story that focuses on a man dubbed the most evil father in human history. And in today's episode, we're going to uncover some of the lesser known facts and details around this case that really do prove just what a monster this man is. Police incompetence that allowed this creature to evade suspicion, bizarre yet believed stories around his daughter's disappearance, and an ongoing prison sentence that is being constantly challenged. This is a prisoner who's now served his time, is deemed no longer to be a public threat, and a man who has expressed his desire to come and live in the UK if he is ever released from prison. This is the story of Josef Fritzl.
Before we get into the story, I just want to warn you guys that this is one of the most sick and twisted things that we have covered on this channel. And we will be discussing themes of serious abuse that this man actually committed. But we will always cover these stories with respect to the family and friends of the victims. That is, the family that deserve our respect. Now, let me set the scene at the start of this case. So we start this story in the early 1980s. Europe is still, even then, dealing with the ramifications of the Second World War. The continent is divided. Germany is still split east and west. The Soviet Union covers most of Eastern Europe, and the fear of nuclear annihilation was incredibly real. In Austria, this fear was crystallized because that country actually lays on the border. As a result, construction of nuclear bunkers was not only normalized, but actively encouraged and subsidized by state and local councils as a necessary and wise precaution against a potential nuclear incident. So when, in a little town called Amstetten in Lower Austria, a man called Josef Fritzl started excavating and renovating the basement of his own building, everyone around them thought that this was a normal thing to do, especially because he had a young family consisting of 7 kids, 4 of whom were still young enough to live in the family home. To the outside world, the family were known to be polite and well behaved. Josef was a highly respected electrical engineer, and neighbours described him and his wife as a lovely couple. And the most depressing part of this story is that no one really knew how sick and depraved this man really was. No one knew the crimes that he had committed before. No one knew about the sick fantasies that he had. And no one knew the plan that he was concocting. So Joey, why don't you tell me a little bit more about who Josef Fritzl actually was?
So Josef Fritzl was born in Austria in the year 1935, and Austria was a very unstable place at the time that Josef Fritzl entered the world. There had just been a brief but hugely impactful civil war in the country, and times were hard. Over a quarter of the country were out of work, there weren't enough benefits to go around, and the threat of a Nazi invasion was very much looming over Austria. And Josef was born to mother Maria and father Joseph Sr., who was reportedly a severe alcoholic and a man who mistreated Joseph's mother. But the treatment towards Joseph from his mother wasn't much better. Fritzl actually claimed that during his life he had never received one bit of affection from his mother, noting that she had never kissed or cuddled him. And he also recalled childhood memories in which he would be laid in a pool of red from his mother's violent beatings. And after his father walked out when he was just 5 years old, Josef Fritzl would never see him again after he allegedly died in battle during World War II. And things were about to go from bad to worse for the only child, because during World War II, his mother was temporarily detained inside of a concentration camp, apparently for her reluctance to conform. And being that Fritzl would have been too young to understand this, the authorities just told him that his mother had died. And as I'm sure you've already guessed from these type of cases, Fritzl would take a lot of this childhood trauma and baggage with him into his adult lives. And this would be something that would have a substantial effect on the decisions that he would make going forward and the behavior that he would show. And his teenage years really were a mixed bag, because you'd be lying to say that he hadn't started some type of progress. Because in 1951, aged just 16, Josef Fritzl moves to Linz and starts working as a technical assistant for an engineering company. He attends college, graduating and earning a qualification, and it's during that time that he meets his wife Rosemarie. She was 15 at the time and Fritzl was older, but the pair later married when she was 17 and Fritzl was 21. And Rosemarie's family initially took to Fritzl, saying that he was well-mannered, he was friendly and nice, but over time, that perception very much changed, with many family members noting that he seemed very possessive and controlling over Rosemarie. And it wasn't just family members or extended family members that had their concerns about Josef Fritzl, with other members of the community even describing him as a peeping Tom. However, Rosemarie neither had the strength or the desire to leave Josef Fritzl at this time, and the two actually started a family together, welcoming 7 children into the world over a 15-year period. Ulrich, Rosemarie Jr., Harald, Elisabeth, Joseph Jr., Gabrielle and Doris were all welcomed into the Fritzl family, but if you felt like Josef Fritzl's own harsh and unforgiving upbringing would have made him have the incentivization to do better by his own children, then you were very, very wrong. I personally believe that Josef Fritzl's upbringing maybe influenced his decision to have more children, maybe off the back of a constant feeling of loneliness, but in terms of his treatment of those children, it really wasn't much better than what he had suffered. Because breeding and caring for children are two very, very different things. And although it would later on be Joseph's child Elisabeth who would make numerous headlines in this case, Josef Fritzl's other children also suffered within that house, with his son Harold later testifying that the abuse that the children suffered inside that house was really awful. And Josef Fritzl was a man that everyone inside of the house was terrified of. And they were right to be terrified, because 1 year after the birth of Elizabeth Fritzl in 1967, Josef Fritzl would strike, leaving the first official warning on just what a monster this man was capable of being. He broke into the home of a nurse and he actually attacked her while at knife point. And the police actually managed to track Josef down and arrest him soon after. He was actually wanted, or at least suspected, of another local assault that was similar at the time, and that meant that they didn't really need to spend too long thinking about who could have committed this crime. And Fritzl was convicted. He was sent to prison for his crime, and many believe that this would be the point in the story in which his wife Rosemarie would have had the perfect opportunity to get away from a man who was clearly showing himself as a predator, as a monster, and as someone who preyed on vulnerable people. But in a move that would shock so many people in this case, Rosemarie stands by her partner. She regularly visits him inside of the prison, and when he's released, she welcomes him with open arms back into the family home.
So the context to remember about Rosemarie, bearing in mind what Joe just said in terms of we cannot believe there's any world in which she would ever take him back. The context is, when they first got together, they basically had a relationship whereby he was the breadwinner, she was the stay-at-home mum, and they relied on each other, much like, you know, traditional couples would have done in this time. This wasn't like an unusual thing at the time. This was very normal. People lived in that way and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't... you say it's not unusual. There probably wasn't any examples that we could think of where the woman was the breadwinner in that time. And therefore... what that did mean is, and especially as well, during a time when countries are at war, men are going to war, men are going off, they don't know whether they're going to be returning and things. I think it was a very different time in maybe which you would see that, you know, partners were more understanding, more forgiving.
Yeah, and look, 4 kids, being able to look after them by yourself as a single parent when you haven't been working, you don't have any income and any economic potential is a very, very scary place. So what we're not trying to do is completely allow her and get her off the hook at this point, but what we're trying to do is provide the context of why she would stay with him. And look, there are plenty of questions to be asked about her. A lot of people and coverage around this case that I've heard is that people say that she sort of switched off at this point. She wasn't really compos mentis in terms of the relationship. She'd given up the romantic side of her life because this guy was so abhorrent and brutal towards her. So she just sort of switched off and dealt with it. So again, we'll never truly understand Rosemary. And I think, again, I mean, we could do a whole episode sort of psychoanalyzing her belief in this. But the key thing at this point is to say is that she stayed with him and her life continued with their children with him from this point on.
Yeah, and he had obviously manipulated her to the extent where he had told her, look, I'm confessing to these crimes because I've already been told that it wouldn't be beneficial for me to not confess to them, for me to go guilty and to get tried, and therefore it's going to be a quicker process. But he kind of let her believe that he was innocent, that he wasn't guilty of this crime. The courts didn't believe that. They made sure that he was convicted of it. He was put on what would have been the equivalent to the register now. It would have been a database or whatever the equivalent was back then where you would know about someone's specific crimes if they fall into this criteria. He was put on that list, Josh. But unfortunately, despite the fact that he spent time in prison as an adult and was tried as an adult, his criminal record, including this very, very serious, violent offence, was wiped after 15 years. It used to be something in the system in Austria and actually many other countries, by the way, where your criminal record was deemed not really relevant after 15 years. It was wiped if you hadn't reoffended. And that meant in the eyes of pretty much everyone around Josef Fritzl, 15 years or so after the trial in which he went to prison for, he was no longer considered a criminal.
So let's get back to the family for a second. As you can imagine, this amazing, lovely reputation that Josef Fritzl and his wife had from the outside was very much not the same that was going on inside that family unit and inside that family home. Because after both physical and verbal abuse, the family dynamic was starting to change in the Fritzl household quite significantly. And this is because Ulrike, Rosemary Jr. and Harold, the 3 eldest children, had all left home to start their adult life. As true crime fans, we know that you're more concerned about your internet safety than, let's say, most people online. And you're right to do so, because the internet just got a whole lot worse. And that's all thanks to the British government, who have been meddling again. And it means that you need to spend about 10 minutes putting in all of your details to get into any website, which means also, by the way, that the website then has your information. People that are not even in the UK are collecting that data on your behalf. And there's only one way to really keep you safe online, and that is thanks to a VPN and our sponsors, Surfshark. And if you want to get it for yourself, it's less than the price of a coffee every single month. All you need to do is hit the link in the description. It's very simply Surfshark/Joey and Josh, and you will get an extra 4 months for free if you use our code Joey and Josh. And if you want to know how it actually works, well, you can just set your location to, for example, let's say Canada, and that would mean that you wouldn't have to go through all of those biometric checks, putting in all of that data just to watch a normal video. And you can also keep all of your data private because a VPN actually masks your IP, and Surfshark therefore keeps you very, very safe when you're scrolling online. And it's not just that. If you want to watch sport, for example, any of the football or any of the boxing, you can set your location to another place. And I've heard it's a lot cheaper than using something in the UK. Just trust me on that one. And whatever device you're using, Surfshark will have it covered. They've got a Chrome extension, for example. They've got an app that I use on the phone all the time. They've got tablet apps, and you can use it anywhere on the internet on your PC as well. And getting it to work is even easier. All it is a click of a button. You'll set yourself to a different location, and it is simple as that. So if you want to support the channel, this is the best way to do it, and it will keep you safe online. Remember, the link is Surfshark/Joey and Josh. The code to use for that discount is Joey and Josh. Remember, you will get 4 months off a year plan when you use that. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, as you always do. Now let's get back to the video. At this time, Elisabeth is 18 years old, and she is therefore the eldest in the family home that is still left. Obviously, there's other kids in the family home, but it meant that Elisabeth got a lot of the pressure and a lot more abuse as well. And the context here is that Josef had actually already been abusing poor Elisabeth since the age of just 11 years old. But in 1984, as I say, she was 18 and she was starting to gain her independence. She was already studying. She was studying actually gastronomy and tourism. She'd actually even got a job as a waitress in a nearby town called Linz. And on the 24th of August 1984, Elisabeth went to speak to her father and she thought she was telling him something very, very innocuous indeed. She wasn't really that concerned about what she was going to be divulging. What she was saying to him is that she was going to go and live with her older sister, Rosemary Jr. And basically they were going to go and live in Linz. She was going to work as a waitress and she was going to basically start her new life with her. What Joseph didn't know at this time was that she'd already moved half her belongings in with her sister. She was going to move the rest. And really, that was the beginning, as I say, of her new life. And Joseph did not react at all well for Elisabeth. He saw this as a crisis moment in his life. This young girl who he had abused for years, gained power over, controlled every element of her life, started to gain independence. And he was incredibly concerned about what would happen if she told anyone about what he had done. He started screaming at her and saying that she was a drug addict. He was saying that she wasn't abiding by any of her rules. He needed control over her again, and he needed it quickly. So what did he do? Well, inexplicably for Elisabeth, he started spending a lot more time in the basement. He had moved a bed, a mattress, and some other supplies down to that room. And on the 28th of August, 1984, Joseph asks his daughter for some help. He gets her down to the basement under the assertion and the ruse that he was needing help to transport a very heavy door. And so basically, Elisabeth's role was to carry the door and help him affix it to the wall. The basement itself had many small rooms and it was linked with very narrow corridors. This wasn't a very big basement. In fact, it was very cramped indeed. Joseph leads Elisabeth past his workshop that she'd been in before and into a hidden area that she had never seen. She diligently holds the door as she is instructed to, but it is at this point that Joseph comes behind her, gets a rag in front of her face, and basically knocks her unconscious using a substance that was on that rag. When she wakes up, she is handcuffed behind her back, and those handcuffs are then chained to a metal pole on the wall. What she found was that the basement itself was a soundproof labyrinth of tiny rooms. There were no windows, there was no natural light, and to get to the outside world, Elisabeth would have had to get through 8 locked doors. The ceilings were oppressive and low. They were only about 1.7 meters tall. The air was poor quality and there was mold growing and there was a constant rancid smell. Rats would often find their way in, and in the kitchen there was just a very simple setup. Then there was a bathroom and a bedroom with some wardrobes. Joseph had made this place livable, but barely, and he created a very real prison for Elisabeth. He even told her that the place was rigged. If she ever tried to escape, the doors would be electrified and gas would flood the basement, meaning that she was in incredible danger. How long he planned this to go on for is not known, but what is clear is that he had no immediate plans to let Elisabeth go.
Well, hold on. Where did Rosemary think Elisabeth was then? She just thought she'd disappeared one day.
Well, this is the thing, and I really don't understand this. And to be fair, I don't really know if I believe Rosemary in that she didn't have anything to do with this or any idea of what was really going on. But anyway, that's alleged, and we don't really know that for sure. But what we do know is that there was a letter sent, and it was in the handwriting of Elisabeth, wasn't it? Basically, she had said, I'm joining a cult. I'm struggling with stuff at the moment. I want to get out of the house and I don't like living with you. Now, there was a precedent for this because Elisabeth had, a year prior to this, tried to escape from the family home, didn't she?
And also, like you say, there were plans for Elisabeth to potentially move out. So when that happened, maybe you can give a little bit of benefit of the doubt and say potentially it was her own handwriting. There was a little bit of smoke to the fire. And you could say maybe Rosemary made an innocent mistake. I think a lot of us would still be saying that she's very, very naive at best. But we'll discuss Rosemary's involvement as we go on. So Elisabeth's now down in the basement.
Yeah, she is. And look, the element that we have to discuss at this point is the authorities. Because obviously a girl has gone missing. And we've seen so many of these cases. We've covered them several times. The immediate time in which we find out that someone is missing is the key period of the case. And the authorities speak to the family and they go, what has happened? And they go, well, we've got this note. She's made it very clear. She tried to run away last year. And so we have no idea where she is. And authorities bought that. They actually felt that Josef and Rosemarie were actively looking for their daughter and they were really worried about her. But the thing is, they weren't.
You say the authorities bought it. I would more just say, if there was ever a time to commit a crime, if there was ever a time to kidnap someone, if there was ever a time to kill someone, it's probably going to be in that little aftermath after the country's been at war, been invaded. So, I mean, I personally think that it probably wasn't the authorities maybe believing the Fritzls. I think it was more so a case of the authorities being way too stretched to even search.
Yep, this is the thing. Look, I will question a lot of what the authorities did. And to be honest with you, I do question this. I look at it and go, did they do enough to actually try and find her? A cult is a very weird excuse. Let's try and find out where the cult is. Let's try and find what the cult's called. Let's try and find out more information about where this young girl is. Problem is, she's an 18-year-old girl. She's allowed to live her own adult life. And I think that was a key contributing factor in this moment of the case. Now, prepare yourselves for this because we're going to go into a slight bit of detail about what actually happened to Elizabeth. So just bear that in mind. What I will say is that Elizabeth was then abused daily, pretty much for the rest of time that she was in this prison, this captivity that Josef was subjecting her to. And not just daily, it was often multiple times a day. And for the first few months, she was physically restrained, and so she could use the toilet and the sink, but not much else. You can imagine how absolutely traumatizing and awful this moment of her life would be, and so much so that Josef would often actually repeatedly beat her as well in this time. And he only, in fact, removed the restraints after that months and months of her being tied up for further abuse. It does not get any worse than this.
See, this is another thing which does make you question Rosemarie's involvement or her knowledge within this case. And it's obviously the fact that, in my opinion, Josef Fritzl's tendencies that you've just spoke about towards his daughter, I don't believe they started the day he put her in the cellar. Personally, I believe that this would have been a disgusting, prolonged process that had probably been going on for a lot of her life. And that means that the period of time in which Rosemarie would have had to have been conscious and taking in her surroundings is a lot longer than the 24 years of captivity.
And this is the thing, right? Like, we've said it already in this episode. She started being abused from the age of 11. This is 7 years of abuse. For the fact that her own mother wouldn't know anything about that, I don't believe.
Close to unbelievable, to be completely honest.
I just think it doesn't make a lot of sense. So this torture continues on for years. The first 5 years of Elizabeth's captivity, she was completely alone. And you can imagine people actually do solitary confinement, and that is the worst punishment that you can actually do for a prisoner, pretty much, where you lock them in a cell, they only get food and water, and they're very much deprived from any communication, from any friendship, from anything. That's a huge thing.
Yeah, and
right?
This is prisoners that have committed crimes that we're talking about.
Exactly.
Not
exactly.
innocent people.
Not innocent people. Exactly, right? So then, 2 years in, Elizabeth actually has something even more painful than this. She actually has a miscarriage. She got pregnant very early on, and 10 weeks into that pregnancy, she unfortunately lost the child. And by all accounts, this spiraled what was already an awful time for her, huge sadness, into a massive depression that she was feeling. In 1987, Elizabeth then became pregnant again, and on the 30th of August 1988, a daughter called Kirsten was born. Josef, this sick bastard, told Elizabeth that she would have to deliver the baby herself. He handed her an old pair of scissors, a blanket, and a book on childbirth. And Elizabeth actually had to deliver the baby completely alone, it completely isolated. And you can imagine anything can happen in pregnancy. So this was an absolute awful moment. But, thankfully for Kirsten, she was delivered healthy and she was actually able to survive the birth, mainly thanks to her own mother's dedication and bravery. Josef didn't return to the basement until 10 days after this birth. And the cycle of these births continued sort of almost by clockwork every 2 years or so. So Stefan, Elizabeth's second child, was born in the cellar on the 1st of February 1990. Both of these children stayed underground with Elizabeth, and they never saw natural light. And because the ceilings were so low and Stefan actually grew to be quite a tall young man, he actually developed a permanent stoop. He was constantly bent over because of how oppressive these ceilings really were. All in all, 7 children were born in the basement after Kirsten and Stefan. There was Lisa in 1992, Monica in 1994, Michael and Alexander, who were twins, born in 1996, and Felix in 2002.
And it's once the children start to develop, start to grow up, isn't it, that Elizabeth's third born child, Lisa, is it she starts to definitely show character traits that are quite different to the other children.
Yeah, exactly that. Lisa was known as being a bit more of a noisy child than her siblings were. And this is where we get into the difference between what Joseph called his upstairs children and his downstairs children. So Lisa, because she was so noisy, but also because the rooms were getting quite full. Again, we've described how cramped and dark it was down in this cellar. It was getting very full very, very quickly. And so Joseph was like, I can't continue to do this. I need to think of another solution to be able to keep them. He couldn't increase the size of the basement at this time. He wasn't able to do that. So he had to come up with another plan. And that's where he decided to bring Lisa to the upstairs, to bring Lisa into the real world, to integrate her into the rest of his family. Now, you might be asking, how did he actually do this?
He'd have had to have had a very, very cunning plan. Something very, very well thought of, in my opinion. Something that was so strong that maybe people couldn't even argue with it.
Exactly.
Or he'd have to have a wife that doesn't bother arguing or asking any questions.
Well, the thing is, right, the authorities always look at sort of abandoned children in a very sort of granular light. You've got to be very careful with, you know, children just left on doorsteps. You've got to figure out who they are. You've got to find out more information about them. This isn't a very common thing. You know, we've seen it in movies happen a lot. You know, it doesn't very often happen. So when it does, authorities are watching you like a hawk. And they did it in this case as well, right? So basically, the baby Lisa is left on the front doorstep. That is apparently Joseph's plan. He's going to say, you know, she was left to me and I'm going to look after her. What he actually did is he made Elizabeth write a note, again in her own handwriting. We've seen this again happen. The note said, I have been in this cult. I have got pregnant. I do not and cannot look after this child. And so therefore, I'm giving it to you. And I hope that you can look after this child on my behalf. Again, what Joseph did, he had to show to the authorities that that was what actually happened. And he said that I now want to adopt the child and actually have the child as my own. Now, key thing with adoption, you have to go through incredible amounts of background checks. You have to go through family history. You also have to go through interviews. Anyone that's ever gone through this knows that adoption is one of the most traumatic and hard processes you could do, because you have to look at yourself, you have to look at your family, you have to go through so many different things. People have to come to your house, and people inspect everything.
Just quickly, what's an instant no?
An instant no would be any sexual crimes, anything in terms of abuse, anything like that. So you might be asking, well, he has a criminal record. So how the hell was he able to adopt this young child? Joey's already said it earlier on. 15 years in Austria is the part in which you can basically be expunged. Like, your criminal record goes up into air. And by this point, 15 years had gone by. And so basically there was no ability for the authorities to see this past.
That obviously can't still be a thing, no? It's got to have been wiped out
Surely
now.
not. Sure. I mean, surely just after this case alone.
Because the thing with the whole 15 years thing is, do you know we actually do something quite similar, or we did at least when I was a kid. Don't ask me how I know. Do you know we do something quite similar in the UK with criminal records before the age of 18?
Go on, what's that?
Well, it gets wiped after the age of 18.
When you're a child.
It did as far back as when I was turning 18 anyway.
But now
right?
it doesn't.
But I don't know whether it now does or doesn't. However, if you had a serious crime on that criminal record, although it might not show up, let's say, for example, when a police car stops you for a roadside pullover or whatever, if you were looked into to adopt a child, something like that, it would still show up.
Or anything in relation to kids, like looking after kids, babysit, like any relation to kids, surely it would show up. So again, I think that, you know, we're talking about different times, aren't we? Now we're talking about the early 90s here in Austria. Like, it's very different from the, you know, the 2025,
Can I tell you something
26
that's
now.
also scary about this lie? And obviously the thing that gives this side of it weight is the fact that the police haven't searched Josef Fritzl's house. They haven't gone down to the basement, but they didn't ever do this, by the way. But if they had done any tests on that child, it wouldn't have been obvious or apparent that Josef Fritzl was lying, would it? Because it was that child. It was her DNA.
Yeah. So exactly, it would be very, very difficult to find. But this happens again in 1995. Another child goes from the downstairs area to the upstairs, and this child was called Monica. Again, another child left on the doorstep with a similar note. And this time, Josef went one step further. He actually got a pre-recorded note, a pre-recorded recording from Elizabeth to actually explain in her own voice to prove that she was alive, that this is what was happening. And again, she had another child that she couldn't look after and that she'd wanted her parents to look after this child, right? But this time, Josef doesn't just adopt the child. He does something a little bit different. And he did it for a financial reason. What he decided to do was foster Monica, because he learned in the period of time between these two children that he could actually gain 400 euros a month if he fostered the children rather than adopting them. So now, not only did this man have every plan, every element of control, but he also had a financial motive to bring the children from downstairs to the upstairs world. Finally, one of the twins, Alexander, was also fostered in the same way when he was just 15 months old. Again, Josef claimed another 400 euros a month to look after him. All in all, social services, as we were saying earlier on, visited the Fritzl family home to conduct the interviews to make sure that they were fit for the adoption and the foster care over 20 times. They went to the home, they searched everything, they looked at every nook and cranny they could find, but what they didn't know was that lying beneath their feet was this basement, was this torture, was the hell that Elizabeth was going through, and they had absolutely no idea. And even more disturbingly than even that was that we mentioned earlier on that there were a set of twins, Alexander and Michael, and they were born in the basement at the time. When they were born, Michael experienced breathing difficulties almost straight away. So Alexander was born and he was fine. Michael was not. And his breathing difficulties got so bad that Elizabeth actually begged Josef to allow him to go to hospital to get some medical care of some description. And it went on for a few days, and you can imagine she's just getting more and more desperate to save this child's life. Breathing difficulties with an infant is something you immediately go to a hospital to. You know, there's something you don't mess around with, do you? You know,
you don't mess around with anything with an infant, mate. You don't like, you know, wrong noise. You're seeking
straight in the hospital.
Advice.
Exactly. But the worst thing about this is that Josef actually refused to go to any medical care. He said he just didn't care at all. And unfortunately, after 3 days, this twin, Michael, actually passed away. And Josef Fritzl takes his body, puts it into a furnace that is within the basement, burns the body, and basically passes away from that moment.
And that for me, you know, has got to be the worst part of the entire case. And it would have been the worst part of this horrible ordeal for Elizabeth Fritzl, because as human beings, we are selfless in a lot of ways. And, you know, I know full well if you were in a bad situation and you could have the opportunity to take the hit, so to speak, rather than a family member of yours having it, I know you would do that. I know it's something that's in our human nature. So the suffering that Elizabeth was put through was awful. It was inhumane. It was absolutely despicable. But I would put every penny to my name that this would have been the incident that hurt her the most. The care, the unconditional love you have for your spouses as a parent is something that someone like Josef Fritzl would only be able to imagine. So what he did there, you know, is the reason why he should die a horrible death, to be honest.
Exactly. And after Alexander was born, the torturous cycle that Josef actually continued and planned and lived his daily life with continues. He even, in 1998, goes on holiday to Thailand, leaving the family in the cellar, still living there. And basically, during this time, he had a freezer in this cellar, and they were to live off the food that was in this freezer. He was gone for several weeks, right? So it's a decent amount of time. During that time,
weird. You'd never suspect someone like him to go and spend 4 weeks in Pattaya, would you?
You would not.
Creepy
Exactly. And I feel like, again, we might one day find out more information about what he was up to in Thailand.
Mate, like, there's no finding it out. What, you don't think he was going and doing illegal activities over there? That's exactly what this fellow was doing.
But when the family was still in this cellar during this time, during these weeks of isolation when he wasn't there, a power cut happens. And during the cellar and during the sort of time that they're in there, all of the food that was in that freezer basically rots. And the family that are there, they have to deal with both the food that they don't now have, but also now the inability that they have to keep the place clean. It's stinking, rotten food leaking out into the basement as well. And they had to deal with all of that, let alone the mold, the horrible smells that they were dealing with on a daily basis.
The not knowing, you know, Josef Fritzl was not a young man. You're going away. No one knows you're down there. Your life's in that man's hands. If that man doesn't come back, that's it.
Yeah, exactly that. Then after this point, Felix is then born in December 2002, and Joseph decided that at this point he should stay in the cellar. So unlike these other children that he's raised up and brought them into the upstairs, he decided that Felix was going to be left in the downstairs, and that was mainly because he deemed that his wife, now in her 60s, was unable to care for another child. So obviously an incredibly compassionate man for the sake of his wife.
It is thoughtful.
Absolute disgrace. By 2007, Joseph was in his 70s, and the children in the cellar were growing up and nearly becoming adults. This concerned him as he knew he could not keep them locked away forever, mainly because the boys could potentially overpower him as they got older. And his grip on reality became more and more loose because he thought he could release Elisabeth and the children and amalgamate them into their existing family upstairs. He soon began buying property in the block where they lived. He was renovating apartments and merging the space into what he thought could be the new family home. His plan involved Elisabeth returning from her cult, claiming that she had escaped and wanted to bring her children back to the wider family. He even forced her to write another letter in early 2008 stating her plan to come back. But the thing is that Joseph's plan was never truly realised. For once, he didn't get his way.
Yeah, and some could even suggest that potentially in the end, it was Josef Fritzl trying to right a wrong, trying to go back on an action that potentially he himself was a little bit disgusted in. And that was obviously the decision to not take baby Michael to the hospital before his tragic passing. And that means in April 2008, when Elisabeth's daughter Kirsten falls ill, Josef Fritzl has the opportunity to right some of the wrongs. Because the disgusting and inhumane way of living has now officially taken its toll on Kirsten's body. And that body's completely shutting down. Officially, her kidneys, her lungs, and her liver are all now failing. Multiple organ failure is currently happening to Kirsten. And although not to an official degree, Josef Fritzl knows this. He knows that he has to act. And that meant that eventually, after several weeks of suffering, several weeks of agony, Josef Fritzl finally agrees to take Kirsten to the hospital. But there's a problem. How does Josef Fritzl all of a sudden explain the presence of this unwell and potentially woman that looks like she's related to them in his basement? He doesn't really have an explanation, so he uses one that's worked in the past. And that meant that, surprise, surprise, another woman, this time a woman, not a baby, has been left on the doorstep of Josef and Rosemary Fritzl. And you're about to find out that the police didn't quite buy this, finally. But Rosemary still apparently does believe it. But when Fritzl eventually takes the young girl to the hospital, the doctors see that Kirsten doesn't look normal. In fact, Kirsten looks like someone that has never even seen the light of day. Not only that, but doctors note how she looks malnourished, and upon inspection, she's hardly got any teeth in her mouth. And most significantly of all, the girl has no medical records, which is going to be vitally important to being able to act and act fast when it comes to saving her life. Obviously, every time any of us go to the hospital, we've got medical records there. Those medical records tell us of our allergies, what medications potentially could be fatal and could be dangerous when giving to us. And if there wasn't that medical record on file, then a lot of hospitals would just have to go on your word. If they don't even have your word for your underlying health conditions, for your allergies and your medical records, they can't really help you. So the hospital at this point are put in such a dilemma, such a difficult scenario, because they have a young girl here who might not make it through the night. but they don't know who her mother is. They don't know who her guardian is, and therefore they don't have any of her medical records. So do you know what they do, Josh? They go onto the television to make a TV appeal for the sick girl's mother.
And the craziest part about that is that Elizabeth actually sees it, doesn't she?
Yep.
She actually has a TV down there, which we haven't mentioned so far, but she actually had a TV linked up to the TV channels.
Yeah.
And she was actually able to see that live.
Yeah, and it would have been a surprise for her. It would have been a shock for her, because although she knew that her daughter was going to the hospital, she would have very much not had any idea that there was going to be a TV appeal. You have to remember, Elizabeth herself might not have even known that the hospital would need medical records for the girl. So this would have been a shock for her. And this was something that maybe uncharacteristically, she actually decides to be brave in that moment, to confront Josef Fritzl when he goes home and to tell him that he needs to take her to the hospital. Elizabeth is ready to quash his worry. She tells Josef Fritzl that she'll go undercover, she'll go in disguise, and the second they get back from the hospital, she and the children will re-enter the cellar. And to her surprise, Josef Fritzl agrees. He takes her upstairs to see his wife and claims that she's returned from the cult, and that not only has Elizabeth returned, she's also brought children with her. And when she walks into the front room and approaches her mother, Rosemary, after 24 years, Rosemary just begins crying, embraces and hugs Elizabeth. And as far as everyone knows at this point, Rosemary is completely oblivious to what has happened. And shortly after, Josef Fritzl takes his daughter Elisabeth along with their children to the hospital. And due to their suspicions around the state of Kirsten, there's actually a police presence at the hospital, meaning that when Fritzl rocks up there with his new family that the police hadn't previously been notified of, and family that also looks dirty and scared, they know something's up, immediately intercepting and separating Josef from Elizabeth. And Josef Fritzl's immediately arrested on the grounds of the hospital, and Elizabeth herself is also taken for questioning. She's scared, she's nervous, she's traumatized, and she does not want to speak to the police. So much so that she forces the police to promise her that she will never see Josef Fritzl again before speaking. And once she has that promise, Elizabeth Fritzl starts the process of an 11-hour confession where she details each and every day of her captivity to the police.
I don't think we can truly quantify to everyone now watching how big this court case was. I remember watching this on the news at the time and just thinking details of this case were so horrific that they kind of stayed with me forever. Like, I remember seeing this and just thinking, this is absolutely massive and something that I'd never even heard before to have actually happened.
Yeah, I mean, I was in school at the time, right? So I was in high school at this time. And I think that probably not at the time, but maybe something that I've realized, especially since doing the podcast covering a lot of true crime cases, is cases you knew about when you were kids are the ones that have really transcended, in my opinion. Yeah. So, for example, when I was younger, I think everyone at school knew about, the Soham murders. I think there was a lot of cases like that, specific ones. This was one that wasn't even from our shores, wasn't even from a country that spoke English as their first language. And this was a case that was extremely high profile. It was front page news in a country that it didn't even happen in.
Exactly that. And the trial itself began on the 16th of March 2009. And Josef Fritzl was actually charged with a litany of crimes. Those including murder by negligence, with the potential of that crime actually having a life sentence of just itself. And that crime was, again, in relation to the death of the infant twin Michael that we described. Enslavement was another charge, and this was because of the way that he captured and imprisoned both Elisabeth and the other children, as well as the thousands of assaults that were committed against Elisabeth as well. False imprisonment and also coercion, which were basically the threats to his family that if they tried to escape, as well as the incest charges. And this absolute piece of work made out that he was innocent. He basically said that he was not guilty to the murder and enslavement sort of convictions. And basically what he said is that if he was guilty of that, he'd be a monster. And if he was a monster, he would have just killed Elisabeth and the children. So obviously he can't possibly be that bad. And he also said that he was actually quite a nice guy because he would bring them a Christmas tree and Christmas presents, and that basically proved that he was actually looking after them and he wasn't that bad.
Do you know what this reminds me of, yeah? Do you remember the Ariel Castro case that we covered? This was the Cleveland kidnapper. This was a man who, in essence, used his children to lure victims in. And he took 3 women, right? He took Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, and Gina De Jesus over a 10-year period and kept them against their will in captivity. He made them watch coverage of the news when they were talking about their disappearance and their crying parents on the news. He made them watch all of that. It was an awful time. When it went to court, his exact words were, there was a lot of harmony within that household. And he suggested that the women weren't there against their will. And what I'm saying is, this is a very distinct and common trait between people that take people captive. They're completely unable to distinguish and realize that if that captor of yours says anything nice, polite, heartwarming to you, they're literally doing it because they're doing it to benefit themselves, whether that be for you to spare them a beating or God knows what worse. Your captors do not like you. There is no harmony. And there definitely was not a man who was not a monster looking after them. Exactly. And I use the word looking after very, very loosely.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is pure psychopathy in personification form. Like, this guy was absolutely ridiculous with what he was saying. But something actually changed on day 3 of the trial. What he didn't know on the first 2 days was that Elizabeth was actually in the public gallery. She was watching the court case itself. She was actually there in secret. No one really knew that she was there. And she was actually wearing a disguise. So basically, it wasn't obvious that it was her. But Josef actually catches her eye during the 3rd day of the trial and notices that it's her. And this just happened to be the day in which her video evidence that you talked about earlier on, the 11 hours of evidence, was actually played to the court. At least a part of it was played to the court. And this is where he sort of goes pale, and something changed in the way that he was treating the trial at this point. He actually says at this point that he is guilty and he confesses to everything, and the trial actually proceeds under that assumption that he's pled guilty and he's sort of admitting to the crime.
In essence, he had enough bottle, is what we would call it, guts. He had enough guts to drag the family through the courts and to get them back into court. But when it was his turn to basically be addressed and hear firsthand from the victim of his crimes, he didn't have enough guts to sit there and listen to that. That's when he goes not guilty, in essence, putting an end to that.
Yeah, he was a complete, like, honestly, can we just say the word pussy? Like, he was a complete pussy,
coward.
Right? Like, complete coward, right? And there was a huge amount of evidence against him. Obviously, you've just said it, the testimony that Elizabeth did, the 11 hours of it. Did you know that the jury were only allowed to play 2 hours of this at a time because it was so harrowing? And she actually spoke, this was 11 hours of footage from both police interviews, but also interviews with psychologists as well, because you can imagine trying to reconcile all of this 24 years of abuse and pain would have been incredibly hard. And the jury themselves, it must have been just traumatic to even hear this, let alone to have actually dealt with it in the way that Elizabeth had to. But it wasn't just that. There were actually objects from the scene that were actually brought in, and the jury were able to even like smell these objects and how rancid and moldy and damp they actually were, so they could actually see the physical evidence in front of them. And the prosecution also showed how cramped the conditions were. They actually used like laser pointers and masking tape to actually show like how like close in the ceilings actually were, how cramped it was. Again, the corridors themselves were only 60 centimeters wide, so you almost had to walk sideways to even get through into different rooms. Like, it was an incredibly claustrophobic environment. It must have been awful to even have been stepped foot in there.
Mate, I can't even imagine, because when you're just telling me about the width of the corridors there, I'm getting that. I'm getting a bit like, oh, fucking hell, I feel a bit claustrophobic. Imagine the ordeal that they must have suffered.
Exactly that. And it was also aided with the benefit of other evidence from experts. They got quite a few different people in to talk at this trial. They got medical experts in that basically suggested that if Michael had been seen to, if the breathing difficulties that he experienced was actually taken to hospital and under the supervision of doctors, he might well and very likely would have survived. So again, this goes against what he was saying, that it wasn't negligence and therefore murder. but the doctors actually said
how the
completely
fuck
was.
would he know whether it was negligence or murder? He's not a fucking doctor. And you just said to me there, oh, they probably would have been able to save him, Josh, yeah?
Yeah.
Newsflash, he probably wouldn't have had a breathing condition if he was kept in a normal environment.
Exactly.
So there would have been no saving.
Exactly that. And it wasn't just the medical experts. They also got psychiatrists to have a look at Josef Fritzl, that he was interviewed several times, and they determined that he had several combined personality disorders, but they deemed him well enough to stand trial and also well enough to know right from wrong, which again is clear in these cases about, you know, someone's capability to understand what actually happened and therefore the ability to convict them.
I'm so glad that you just said it was deemed not relevant in terms of his personality, yeah? Because when you say someone's got a personality disorder, a personality trait, right? Usually it gets found out where that they've got that personality disorder or trait.
Tell me.
When they're going through the court process.
Yeah.
And usually someone's going through a court process because they've probably done a bad crime. Yeah. So if you've killed someone, if you've took someone captive, if you've let, I don't want to say it. If you've let bad things happen to an infant, yeah. I don't really need to know that you have a personality disorder. Yeah. I've made my opinion up on you.
Exactly. There's no excuses here. And to be fair, the court felt that way as well, right? And it wasn't just that. The psychiatrist also said that he continued to have a danger to society, which is another reason why they wanted to increase the sentencing and therefore not allow him out of prison. Harold, Elizabeth's brother, also spoke via video link to actually testify that he was also abused and also subjected to immense pain and physical trauma because of his father, which also led to more sort of weight to the case as well.
And Harold was he wasn't Elizabeth's son, so he was obviously upstairs in the house during those sort of formative years, which again kind of makes me think, and tell me if I'm wrong here, mate. You might go along with me, you might not.
Yep.
We know that Elizabeth was already being abused before she got put in the cellar. We now know that Harold was abused. Where was Rosemarie? Why did Rosemarie not know anything? She didn't know anything for 25 years when her daughter was in the cellar downstairs.
This is the thing. I just have no understanding or ability to comprehend the fact that she didn't have some inkling of this. Both also, more than anything, knowing the man. Like it's her husband. She'd been with him for a very long time, multiple years, multiple decades. You kind of know the man that you're with. And I think, again, what I was saying earlier on about her switching off, that is not to excuse her. That is to just understand where she was mentally. But the fact of the matter is, I feel like she knew everything. And the fact is that she was never really brought up in any kind of criminal proceedings, as far as I'm aware. She certainly wasn't involved in this trial in any significant way. And I just think that's awful.
One of the things that might have made relevance in that, the fact that she didn't have any sort of criminal charges put against her, may well have been her initial sort of relationship, I would say, with Elizabeth. We spoke about the fact they embraced. I know that after the trial and whatnot, I'll tell you in a minute, that they did have some contact. So I think that may well have played a part.
Yeah, there you go. And it wasn't just all of that evidence. There was also DNA evidence. Obviously, they tested all of the children and they proved that they were related to Josef Fritzl. And it was very clear from this point that the case was against him. So finally, after all of these years of pain, Josef Fritzl was finally found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and the court ordered that he serve his sentence in a secure institution for mentally abnormal criminals, basically a psychiatric prison unit, due to his diagnosis. Now, under Austrian law, the sentence included the possibility of parole, and that sentence and that parole ability was given after just 15 years. But Joey, you might be able to tell me whether he was actually able to ever go under that parole hearing, or whether he was actually able to get out early under that, or is he still inside now?
Oh, he's still inside. There
Thank
are
God.
Definitely unanswered questions in this case, some that we'll speak about now.
Yeah.
And Josef Fritzl's time inside of prison hasn't been as uneventful as some may have suspected it would be. Because whether he's elderly or not now, whether he's, you know, a strong gust of wind away from a morgue, the prisoners aren't that forgiving on Josef Fritzl. The prisoners' memories goes back a little bit longer than 15 years. And they know exactly the man that's locked up with them. A man that was immediately deemed way too high a risk to mix when he was sent to prison. Even that being said, a man that is still under 24/7 surveillance by guards because of how dangerous it is for him in there. And the tragic irony about Josef Fritzl's time in prison is, regardless of whether it's a better prison or a worse prison, his living conditions aren't going to be anywhere near as bad as he subjected his daughter and her children to. Unlike his daughter and her children, Josef Fritzl is able to go outside, and he actually has a garden that he's able to plant tomatoes and peppers in inside of his prison. And if you thought that was bad, in 2016, the public were sent into frenzy when it emerged that Josef Fritzl had joined an online dating website from inside of the prison. At least that is what people thought at first. And I think that a lot of people had enough of a brain inside their head to establish that this was probably a hoax. This obviously wasn't Josef Fritzl. But the problem came when the authorities obtained the IP address that was used to sign up to that dating app. And that IP address was tracked back to Stein Prison, where Josef Fritzl was currently incarcerated. However, it didn't turn out to be Josef Fritzl that had started this dating profile. Instead, a couple of inmates that were on the same wing as Fritzl had used his pictures, had set up the profile, and were actually messaging people. They felt like it was funny, it was a joke, but one person that wasn't happy about it and was ready to confront the men was Josef Fritzl himself. He catches wind of it, he understands what they've done, and he moves out onto the wing to approach the men and to ask them why they did it and to take it down. And when he does that, the men are very unforgiving. They launch a sustained attack on the pensioner, both knocking his teeth out and leaving him unconscious on the floor. And aside from the beating, insiders claim that he has gone stir crazy, with none of his family willing to speak to him. They say that he's written to his wife, Rosemarie, over 8 times, but has never had a response. And as of 2026, Fritzl is now 90 years old. He's actually legally changed his name to Josef Meyerhoff, and he's deemed to no longer be a threat to the public due to the fact that I don't even know if Fritzl could now tell you what his real name is. He's said to have very far onset dementia and is physically incapable, suffering from hallucinations. And it's actually reported that those who have interacted recently with Josef Fritzl say that he believes before he went to prison, he was actually a former pop star. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, and that's absolutely ridiculous.
It's mental,
What
isn't
is
it?
he? Yeah.
I can think of a former pop star that he reminds me of. It was actually reported also that his lawyer has claimed that he is showing remorse and that he's upset for his crimes. However, there are conflicting reports to come out from that, because other experts claim that he still has a significant criminal energy and he actively downplays his crimes. And it's probably a good time to tell you that, of course, Josef Fritzl, the man who did this heinous crime, is suspected of more crimes. You don't get a man like this with this sort of criminal profile and then you don't have police putting dots together of other disappearances, of other high-profile cases. And there are a lot of these cases, but there is one significant one. And this is a case that police are currently investigating and believe that Josef Fritzl is probably the front runner in terms of suspects for. And this was a woman named Martina Posch who went missing in 1986. She was a 17-year-old. It's been said that she had striking resemblances to Elisabeth, Josef Fritzl's daughter. And she was actually found wrapped in tarpaulin opposite a campsite that Josef Fritzl and his wife Rosemarie ran. So a missing woman who fits the description of another woman that Josef Fritzl did commit unthinkable crimes against was pretty much found dead on Josef Fritzl's land. Let's be honest, a couple of feet separate it. I think if I'm a police officer, I'm going to be looking into that one too. But when I speak about unanswered questions, there is still one that I really want to get an answer from you on, which obviously will just be an opinion, Josh, but did people know about what Josef Fritzl does? Because the official narrative that was put to us is that no one other than Josef Fritzl and the people that were in that cellar knew about the crime. However, it's very, very, very hard with any sense of realism and common sense in your head, in my opinion, to believe that that is the case.
Yeah, when I'm looking at it now, I'm thinking the one that we've got to talk about is Rosemary. We've mentioned her name quite a few times in this episode. I want to know what happens after he gets sent down. He's in prison. What does she then do with Elizabeth? Like, do they have a relationship? Do they know each other? Are they friendly? How does it work?
So it starts off with obviously them embracing when Elizabeth returns home from the cult. And actually, Rosemary moved in with Elizabeth and her children after this. But it was very short-lived. It only lasted for a couple of months. And I think ultimately what happened is once Elizabeth had started to adjust to life, she probably had a lot of the same questions that me and you have raised today, such as, why was Rosemary not trying harder during those years to contact her, to look for her, to raise the awareness about her? Why did Rosemary not question Josef Fritzl harder when multiple children and then an adult turns up on his door? Why did Rosemary take Josef Fritzl back after he committed an awful crime against another innocent woman?
And we've got to talk about this. How did she not even know, Rosemary, how did she not even know about the basement? Because he was spending a load of time down there, and it's just strange, isn't it? Where was he? What did she think he was doing?
Well, she did know, mate, because he made it very, very clear that Rosemary was to never, over a 24-year period, disturb him when he's in the basement, not even to bring him a drink, like a cup of coffee or something like that. But this is where it leads me on to even more problems with this case, because, you know, the door, one of the 8 doors that was on the basement, by the way, do you know that door weighed 660 pounds, right?
Yeah, it was pretty much like a reinforced concrete door, pretty much, wasn't it? Like, basically, they're saying this was the nuclear shelter door.
You're a young, fit lad, if I may say so myself.
Thank you.
Do you think you could pick up a 660-pound door, position it, frame it, drill it in? Do you think you could do that now at the age you're at?
Absolutely not. Probably not even with 2 people to help me.
What about if you were considered an old age pensioner? If you are by law considered that, do you think you would?
Don't think he's strong enough.
No, I don't think he's strong enough. And also, this is a bit which I haven't really spoke about to this point. You know, the lack of room upstairs in the house, one of the sort of factors that apparently led to Josef Fritzl's thinking, there wasn't enough room for Elizabeth and her family up there. Yeah, there was room for over 100 different tenants over that 2-decade period. Josef Fritzl and Rosemary rented out a room in that house to over 100 different tenants. Over 100 different people lived feet above where a whole family was held captive, and none of them had any idea, correct?
That's what they say.
Or do they? Because one tenant that lived there claimed that he did see another large man walk down into the cellar with Josef Fritzl. This tenant remembered it because it was very, very clear and apparent that the cellar was off limits. And therefore, he asks Josef Fritzl, whoa, what's he doing? Josef Fritzl tells him it's the plumber. I believe that tenant. A large man went down there. My guess would be to hang the door. My guess would be that there's definitely other people that knew during the captivity what was going on here. Would you agree with that?
I think there's entirely feasible. And the thing is that we never really hear from that plumber. We never really hear who he was. We never really understand anything to do with his backstory. And in fact, none of these people were ever really questioned or asked by police or, in fact, indeed, even social services about what this room was and why no one was allowed down there. So it is slightly strange. And this is the thing. This is why there is a few conspiracy theories about this case, about who these people were. Were they involved more than, we even know or believe? Is there evidence against them? So there's a lot more to this story, I think, around that case than we might initially say.
To try and just sort of see things off a little bit of a better ending to this story and a little bit of comfort for the family and those involved. The children were given new identities. Elisabeth Fritzl herself was obviously given a new identity, but the children remained living with her. And they actually remain living with her to this day, according to reports. They reside in a custom-built house with bright colours and really large window spaces to obviously help them, I suppose, adapt and adjust really to their time spent in the darkness. The local community that they live in, which obviously we won't say where, very, very highly protective of the family. You know, media and press and things like that just are not welcome at all. And it's reported that Elizabeth herself actually married a person that was said to be her bodyguard during this time, during the trial and things like that. So obviously, look, a horrific case, but I think it just goes without saying that we wish all the best and hope for, you know, complete comfort and everything good going forward in the lives of Elizabeth and her children.
Yeah, 100%. And look, we only covered this case really because so many of you had asked this, in particular, the members of the channel. And if you do want to become a member of the channel, provide cases that we would then cover, feel free to do so. There is a link in the description. There's also a join button just right down below. It only costs the price of a London-based coffee.
And I'm going to let them in on a little secret here.
Go on then.
Right? You can correct me if I'm wrong. So far, out of our membership suggestions, I believe we've either pretty much covered every one, and if we haven't covered it, believe me, we get a lot of suggestions. They're right on that notebook, ready to cover, and some of them have even begun preparation on. So the members' suggestions in terms of the cases is something that I want to look down the lens and say, thank you very much, because you've suggested some absolute crackers, and it really is your way to leave your own personal print on the channel, isn't it?
100%. And look, if you want us to cover more cases just like this, do us a favor and like this video, because it will indicate to other people that this is a good one and one that they should absolutely watch. And also, if you want to watch a case just like this, why don't you watch the Ariel Castro case that we talked about earlier on in this episode? A very similar kidnapping case involving elements of the family. So yeah, go and hit that one. If you don't want to watch that one, there's another link right below that of a video that YouTube recommends. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.